Do you enjoy it?
Doing what? Making sculpture? Yeah, I love making sculpture. I can't, I mean, I've been making sculpture since I was 15, so, I mean, literally, since I was 15, that's when I made the decision that that's what I wanted to be. And
why?
I just made, I loved the idea of making things. And actually, I say it could be anything, it couldn't be anything. But I mean, it could be a process. So in the early stages of making sculpture, there was something about making molds, you know, like casting something from one material to another, that I just found fascinating. I mean, it was just fantastic. I just loved working with stuff, with materials.
It's quite weird for a 15-year-old to want to do that.
Probably. Yeah, it probably was, to actually make that decision and then to go to art school at the age of 17 and going into a foundation course, and then I said they wanted me to do all this other stuff, you know, like printmaking, painting, fashion, textile, all this stuff, and I just said, I'm not doing it, you know, I'm only making sculpture. This is what I want to do, and I was pretty stubborn, you know, about it for that age, and I stuck with it, and I just said, no, I'm not, that's all I'm doing, I'm just making sculpture. And even drawing at that point, which you know, drawing is important to me now in a way, but at that time when they wanted me to do life drawing, I thought it's got absolutely no relevance to what I'm doing, because I started making sculpture, you know, in a figurative way, but it didn't last very long. I mean, I worked in a figurative way for about a year.
Do you remember your the first, you know?
Yeah, no, I remember making, I remember because I had to make them for, you know, sort of GCSE examination, things like that. So I remember making this apple. It's called Apple and its Core. So I had to try and make this spherical object which kind of looked like it had a bite out of it. You see, this is interesting now because it's just occurred to me that the object that I made incorporated a bite and then the actual core of the apple that you could see inside through the bite. And it's now, never occurred to me until now, but actually there's a lot of sculptures in that.
Oh, wow.
So the kind of project was an apple and its core, and I took it to try and show this inner part that was still part of the same thing. So I remember that sculpture very well, and that incorporated quite a few different processes, because I had to actually make a completely equally sort of thick sphere. It wasn't really apple shape. I chose to sort of make it much more sort of simple and make it spherical, and then, you know, so it was a kind of abstracted apple, if you like.
Are influences important to you?
Well, I think they're important to every artist, and I've never understood why artists try to sort of hide that. You know, any artist has been influenced. I mean, if you look at the work of Tony Caro, you know, without the work of David Smith, I don't know that you would have had Tony Caro. So, you know, artists come out of other artists, and they come out of looking at their work, and it's how things progress. One of the things that I would say is that, you know, I very definitely think that sculpture is a specific thing. You know, making sculpture, it's a subject like anything else, but I don't believe in going off at a tangent just for the sake of it. I don't want to make work that is, you know, that I'm trying to make something that's shocking for the sake of it or different for the sake of it. I make what I make, and what I'm trying to do is to work with the language of sculpture and to extend it, you know, to try and work with it and push it, but it's still very definitely sculpture. You know, I would love to make I'd love to come up with something, and I think these have something of it. I'd love to make sculpture where people come in and think, what is it? But not in the sense that, not in the sense that I would dig up your back garden and put it across the floor. Not in that sense. In the sense that I'm actually making something that because of the way that I've worked, because of the kind of accidents that have happened because the way that I've used my eyes in order to allow the sculpture to develop, that I would end up at a position where my eye has kind of developed something, not my head. It's not a kind of intellectual or an idea about something. It's a very strongly visual thing. So throughout my whole career, that's been what's important to me.
Is that why you do it?
It's not why I do it, but it's one of the things that's important in terms of what I do. You know, so after making figurative sculpture, it didn't feel enough. It didn't feel enough. So I very quickly started making. Again, you see, interestingly, towards the end of my foundation course, I worked with a factory who made these sculptures in sheet metal and mesh. And again, you could see I cut away the sculptures, although they were made in metal, I made them wood-like, so they had almost like wooden joints that overlapped. And if you imagine that one part might be open with a mesh or a grid, so you could see into the metal boxes. So again, there's a connection. They were very minimal sculptures, but I didn't consider them to be minimal. They were minimal in the sense that they were boxes, but they were actually very expressive in the sense that they tried to say something about space and volume and inner spaces and overlapping and all of these sorts of things that sculpture can be about. So I like to take those more abstract elements and deal with it. You always get that question, what do they mean? What do they mean? What are they about? It's a really difficult thing to answer, particularly because when you've been making sculpture for this long, a lot of the things that you do, it's like you don't even have to think about it. It's just part of your kind of language, part of your way of working. So it's sort of second nature to do things. But it's very important to me that these things they are objects. And in answer to your question, do I enjoy it? It's fantastic. I mean, to be in a studio with stuff and have the time to kind of mess about, really, play around. I mean, there are times when it's very frustrating when you're making something, but generally speaking, it's just great at the end of the day to have made something. These particular sculptures to me are really important because they have a kind of energy that comes from a particular flow of making. I've made sculptures on occasions where they've taken me years to make. These sculptures seem to be, they have to be made in a way where I'm focused on that sculpture for a period of time. There's a start and a finish to it. And in a way, they've just come out, there's a real flow with them. There's not this kind of agonizing over relationships between things. It kind of just seems to work. People have talked about not just the title of this exhibition being Overlap, but these sculptures are about overlapping. And for quite a few years, I've actually been interested in layering things. So I was using things like cages and being able to see through things. I've been very interested in sort of architectural elements in my sculptures. So there are parts that look like windows, that look like doors, the scale of different elements. And even in the wood, in the prints and the works on paper, there are very strongly kind of architectural elements in those. I guess if I go right back to the first sculptures that I ever made, I've always made objects that have a kind of completeness about them, that they have to work as a complete object. And interestingly, Lee Tribe, who arrived yesterday, who had not seen these sculptures, said they feel very complete. And what I find with these sculptures is that they're so three-dimensional. When we were trying to photograph them with the photographer, we had to take so many different views of the sculptures because from every different point they have a different feel, a different look. And often sculptures have a view that you would say, oh yeah, this is the view you would choose, to photograph a sculpture or to look at a sculpture. But these are so three-dimensional, and probably some of the most three-dimensional works that I've made. I suppose if I go back to art school days, you know, I studied at St Martin's, and the tradition at that time probably was more to do with welded steel sculpture being made from scrap elements. So a lot of my contemporaries worked with elements that had a sort of pre-existing character, pre-existing history. And I didn't really want to do that. So throughout my career making sculpture, I've always tried to form the sculpture out of a more anonymous material. So with these particular sculptures, you know, they're formed from sheet metal, and actually it's the same thickness in every sculpture. So in a way, by paring that right down to that simplicity, it's actually given me a lot of freedom to do other things with the sculpture. The colour is an interesting one, because, you know, we always felt that after the 60s, it was like sculptors, oh, we can't really use colour, you know, it's been done, and then you think, but it's colour, you know, it's not, no one has a right to that, you know, we can do whatever we want. I don't know, I've always sort of felt that work from the 1960s, the new generation sculpture, has been incredibly important, and I felt that they never really took it to its conclusion, really. I think it was a very short period of time that these things were being made, and then sculpture kind of moved on to something else. It was a time, as it is now really in art history, where change seems to be more important than, you know, than kind of continuing with something. And, you know, sculpture moves slowly. I mean, real sculpture moves very slowly. You know, hundreds of years can go by without things changing much. Or if you go back in time, that's how it might have worked. And everyone nowadays expects things to be, you know, different. Another exhibition has to be completely different from the previous. Things have to move on in this way. And I kind of think that's a pity, because sometimes things have not really been given their full opportunity to, you know, to come to fruition, really. I mean, going back to the sort of 60s works, you know, where sculpture sat on the ground, it was such an important change for sculpture that, you know, it came off the plinth, and it inhabited the same space that we inhabit. And I think those sculptures, these sculptures that I've made, are very much like that. You know, that's very important, that they're objects in our space.
You said when Lee came to see them, he said that he thought they were very complete.
Yeah.
So I was just going to ask about when you're, in terms of finding a place to finish, like when you're making a sculpture, is that the aim, to create a complete?
It's a really difficult thing to answer. One of the things that I try to avoid is using the same solutions to things. You know, it's very easy when you've been making sculpture for, you know, 40 odd years to come up with solutions to certain problems. And in a strange sort of way, the fact that these are, well, I should go back to move, you know, one of the important things for me was moving mainly out of London. So I spend most of my time now in Kent, in Faversham. And about 2.5 years ago, we bought this extraordinary Lionworks. In the introduction to the catalogue, Nicholas Usherwood wrote, and he came and spent some time there, and I think he saw the importance of this, not just the building, but my surroundings there, that actually did change the way that I've worked, you know. And there's a strong connection between the actual building, because it's circular, conical and circular, and these sculptures. And I think just something about the sort of outside space, and London sometimes feels so claustrophobic. And I've always worked in studios, you know, I've always worked in quite big spaces, but they're still, you know, you're still in a building, you're still in a confined space. And there's something about working and living with space around you that changes things. I'm sure it was the reason that Henry Moore, chose to live where he lived, you know, and made the kind of sculptures that he made, which were fantastic outdoor sculptures. And we don't tend to do that anymore. Most sculptors that make outdoor sculptures tend to make them as enlargements or fabrications from maquettes or ideas. Whereas I think it's really important to actually be able to make them the scale at which they're going to be seen. So, but the thing about the completeness of them, I suppose if I think back to things that were made in the 80s, where I was actually putting things together in steel, and I had this enormous saw that I had in my workshop, which I would literally put the whole sculpture, once I'd fabricated and put things together, I'd put the whole sculpture in the saw, and I could chop right through the top, what would become the top of the sculpture, and the bottom of the sculpture. And it made the sculpture have this kind of tension, almost like a kind of drum-like surface, this taut surface. And then I started to actually cut elements that were put together, not completely randomly, but knowing that they would be cut, so that then that surface would become something that the viewer would look at. And they had this kind of very complete feeling, very different, I think, from, say, Cara's work, which has this kind of much more gestural and spread out quality. My sculptures have always felt that they could have been carved out of a block in a way. So even these sculptures, which although they're fabricated, they have a sense that they're kind of cut, you know, not just the cuts that allow space through them, but even the shapes. It feels as if they're very contained, very complete, very they have a kind of tension in them as well. Someone also talked about the overlaps and the shapes as being like the shapes that you would get in a when they're making clothes, and you're cutting the patterns out for suits or for, you know, coats and jackets and they have that kind of quality. And it's strange because when they were hung up in the studio waiting for bits to dry when they're painted, they very definitely had that kind of quality of elements that were but then when they're put together, they have this real sense of everything needing to be there. So when it comes to how do I finish something, it's when the sculpture gets to a point when there's nothing there that for me is wrong or that jars to my eye.
So the process, Elizabeth, so you walked in the studio, put music on. Where do you start?
Well, each kind of sculpture is different, and what I've tended to do over the years is that I start with certain ideas, concerns, materials. I never end up making something that I know about. It's not like I'm not a designer of sculpture, I'm a maker of sculpture. I'm very strongly about making objects, making things, and so materials are incredibly important, processes are important. And I guess I arrive at something through a process and a period of time, and I look at things a lot. So I try for things not to be too intellectually formed. I like to use my eyes, and so if something's happening in the work that suggests that the sculpture's going in a different direction, I'll go with it. You know, I won't try and restrict what's happening in front of my eyes to what's in my head. I'll try to make, you know, real what I'm seeing in front of me. And so I'll emphasize that, or I'll go with it. And so with these particular sculptures, you know, there's been changes along the way. The first one or two, which is the powder-coated one downstairs, there's a difference there in the sense that it's welded together. There's fabricated sections. And with these pieces, it kind of naturally evolved that the pieces would be bolted together. And it sounds like a very simple thing, but it was a fantastic discovery in a way, or change in the work, because I started off by thinking, well, it's good they'll need to come apart to be painted, because I definitely wanted to use colour with them. But the actual nuts and bolts and things like that started to become part of the sculpture. So that's an example of how when you're working, you know, your head might be telling you, oh no, this wouldn't work, but your eye tells you, well actually it's become part of the process and part of the visual language of the sculpture. I love being in my studio. Do I care what people think? It wouldn't make a scrap of difference to me whether you know, if I don't sell things, I'm still making, you know, I've made over 1,000 sculptures in my life. You know, I have half of them in storage. So, you know, you sell some, but it doesn't, you don't make sculpture to sell them, you make sculpture to learn something about yourself, like in anything. You know, if you're an actor, you do it to try and discover more about yourself. And so that's why I do it. And each time I make another sculpture, and I remember making sculptures at St. Martin's, I had this fantastic period of time when I would work during the summer for about 5 weeks. I'd work on a building site in the morning and in a pub at night, and work as much as I could to earn enough money so that I could then get a week or two before everybody came back to college. They allowed me to get locked into the college. And I remember making these, they were called the wall series. They didn't go on the wall, they actually were like barriers. And I showed them at the New Contemporaries, and then they were exhibited at the Leicester Gallery as my first one-man show, and they were huge, 24 feet long, you know, big pieces. And I remember making them at St. Martin's. I would have been 20 then, and I would leave, I'd start to leave at the end of the day, and then I'd get to the door and I think, no, I've got to go back in again, because I was so excited about what this thing did, what this object was doing, which I couldn't understand how it was doing what it was doing. It was just doing something that was so, I felt was so good, that I was so excited. Yes, I still get it. I still have that sense of walking around, and I've had my experience with these sculptures has been very much like that, because I'm so excited about them. I've never lost that excitement. You know, I still feel like I'm a young artist. I'm not, but I still have that same sense of excitement and discovery and all of the things that I had when I was, you know, 15, 16, 17. It's never changed. And I'm totally committed to it. So, you know, every day I'm in there making sculptures.
You say that every time you make a sculpture you're learning something new. After making 1,000, are you still learning things?
Yeah. No, I'm learning things every day. If at the end of the day I don't feel that I've discovered something, then it's not been a very good day. And it doesn't have to be massive discovery. They're all different kinds of discoveries. You know, it can be very, very small thing. But I mean, just as an example, with the painting of these works, it wasn't a conscious thing. The idea that these edges become a different colour from the other side, which sort of, where they overlap, where you get this fantastic sense of one thing touching another, that's something that came about just through painting them, you know, just through, how do you do that? What do you do? And it wasn't like, if I do X, Y, and Z, this will happen. You know, it was a kind of magic moment, which is fairly obvious, but there's something about it which I looked at it and I thought, wow, that really works. You know, it works in a great way. Something about the kind of silhouettes that these sculptures have. You know, and they're changing all the time. So I don't consciously then say, I'm going to make this. What I do is I keep making them and they change gradually. And if I stop making them for a few days or a week or something, I find I move back in again. And inside myself, there's been a shift, there's been a move forward. So I've absorbed something about them and they've naturally wanted to move on. It's a kind of organic shift that they do. So the next, I've just finished 2 that I finished last week, and I'm about to get more materials and things like that. But I know that in a week, they're going to be different. So in no way have I got to a point where I feel that I'm repeating myself, even though I've made 17, and if you came into the studio, you'd say, oh, they're Jeff Lowe's. So they have a kind of, you know, they look alike, but they're not, I don't feel like I'm just repeating myself or making the same thing. I feel that each one has a different sense about it, and it's trying to do something a little bit different, you know. And so where these sculptures will go next, I don't know, but I can feel something's changing in the work where the next ones will be quite different. But not different in the sense that, that they won't be recognisably these, but you will have a completely different experience when you look at them, I hope.